Welcome to our continued study in the book of Esther. We have been exploring the details of this amazing story of Esther. And as we begin, I believe that the dramatic events found in chapter 6 and 7 of Esther can be summed by a verse found in the book of James that says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. In chapter 7, we find that Haman, the prideful narcissist, received what was due to him at the end of his life. Mordecai, on the other end, even though first neglected, is rewarded for his heroic report that ended up saving the king, and King Xerxes eventually transfers the estate of Haman to Esther. The Lord is at work and in the detailed events of this chapter. The Lord's providence is seen as the king tosses and turns in his royal bed. The Lord was in the details when King Xerxes called for the records of his kingdom to be read to him in the middle of the night. It was during this reading the king asks if anything was ever done for Mordecai. The king discovers that Mordecai's act of great loyalty has been overlooked all these years, 5 of them. Mordecai's report concerning the assassination attempts by Bigthana and Teresh was well received, was recorded, it was acted upon, but Mordecai was never rewarded. And here is a moment of reflection for us. Have you ever felt like your act of kindness, your friendship, and your loyalty to someone or to an organization was completely overlooked and taken for granted? Did you ever feel like you did a great act, but it was just brushed aside? Others benefited from your sweat and your skill, and you got pursed over. That promotion that you well deserved, the car that you deserved, that someone else cheated. They seemed to thrive while you were struggling. Do you think that God Almighty, the divine I am, has missed on rewarding you when you acted in obedience, when you chose the right moral thing to do? Perhaps you have felt ignored, forgotten, and neglected for your kindness and good work. You are not alone. Mordecai might have felt that way too, especially considering the favors that his nemesis Haman was experiencing at the palace in Susa. You know what? What is amazing is that even as things are not going well and in his favor, Mordecai does not call in a corner and then begins to cry and feel sorry for himself. He does not complain or murmur, but what we know is that he knows that his Redeemer liveth and that he who rewards in silence is not asleep. Mordecai seems to know something about his heavenly Father that would be important for us to know. He makes a conscious decision to leave it all to the justice of God. In fact, the lack of recognition doesn't even seem to bother Mordecai. Do you think that Mordecai had learned the secret of contentment, regardless of earthly consequences and recognition? Do your actions and reactions to injustice acted upon you or on you resemble those of Mordecai? See, the king's lack of sleep in chapter 6 opened the gates of blessing for Mordecai and Esther. The king's solution to his midnight crisis or midnight insomnia was to have the book of Chronicles read aloud to him in the middle of the night. Who does that? Well, it is during this midnight reading that the king discovers that Mordecai was not rewarded for his efforts and his allegiance to the king. And the king was extremely mortified. He was not happy with what he was hearing. You think he was sleepless before? Now he is really sleepless. And this time he's thinking, how come Mordecai has never been officially honored for exposing the assassination of the king? Maybe Haman had something to do with it. Who knows? What we know is Haman does not like Mordecai at all. Moving forward from here, we can say with confidence that the story of Esther pivots from this point forward. Yes, the king's dreams, an insignificant event by comparison to the other events in this book, but these dreams of the king lead to the providence of God. Yes, a sleepless night leading to a divine appointment. You may not see it, but God is working in the background of these details. God's mighty hand is present in each of these seemingly insignificant events, including the recording of Mordecai's report in the books of Pasha. God's providence is witnessed by Haman's timely arrival in the inner court of the king that particular morning. Haman had just come to seek permission to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he was building. But before Haman could get the permission to proceed with his plan, the king called him into his chamber, and before he could utter a single word, the king asked Haman, listen to this, what should be done for the man the king wishes to honor? The narcissist, the egotistic and selfish Haman made the assumption that the king was referring to him and therefore wanted to honor him. Can you see the gleam on his face and smile that flows from his face? His response comes across as being so premeditated. It's like he had been thinking of this wish list for a while. So with a happy expression on his face, Haman suggests a reward that would be equivalent to his ego, a surprise that would match his envisioned grand honor. Notice that Haman did not need more wealth or materialistic stuff. He had that already. He had power and authority. He lived and enjoyed all the luxury afforded to him by the king. He was the second in command. Remember, in fact, that he wore the king's ring and authorized the king's budget. What he requested was the honor of wearing the king's robes and riding in the special bred horses for the king. In a one-man's parade throughout the kingdom, Haman wanted to see himself being recognized by all. He wanted to measure up to the powers of the king. Haman wanted the king's prestige, power, and honor to be his. He wanted to be co-equal with the king. His priority and chief goal was to be recognized and seen as a real man, if not being superior to the king. He was full of pride and a true manipulator by every sense of that word. Haman only thought of himself. Nothing mattered more to him than fame and admiration. Haman's desire for personal fame and glory seduces him to make a request that made him look real bad. Yeah, but here is a turning point for both Haman, the evil plotter, the selfish narcissist, and for Mordecai, the humble servant. The king says to Haman, go at once, get the robe and the horse, and do just as you suggested. For Mordecai, the Jew who sits at the king's gate. What a surprise. Everything goes boom right on his face. Max Lucado says Haman's blood rushed out of his brain. He could not fathom just standing there and seeing this come to an end. Mordecai, of all the people, can you imagine Haman's reaction? His jaw dropped and his mouth was left wide open in lack of words. Well, Haman had no choice but to obey. The king commanded, and that command was to be obeyed. What a crushing blow to the ego and the pride of Haman. Not only was Mordecai given the honor that Haman desired, but now Haman was forced to lead Mordecai, his enemy, through the city, proclaiming, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor, in verse 9. At this time, I believe that the residents of Susa had seen Haman's giant gallows, and it's most likely that they also knew of this animosity and hatred that exists between Mordecai and Haman. When Haman's wife Zeresh and the friends learned that Mordecai was a Jew, they knew that Haman would not succeed. Look at verse 13 of that chapter. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but you will surely fall before him. Zeresh knew something about the history of the Jewish people. She knew something about the God of Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac. If anything else, she must have heard about him. She must have learned about the story of the Israelites in Egypt. She tells Haman, you are messing up with the wrong person. But of course, Haman will ignore all this to accomplish his evil plot. So in chapter 7, Esther enters the banquet on the second day, hopefully thinking and being very hopeful that the redemption will go her way. Redemption will surely come. While Haman enters the banquet while dancing on cloud 9. He knows his plan is on course and nothing will stop it. And he is committed to make sure that the plan succeeds. So during the banquet, King Xerxes once again asked Esther to tell him of her petition. Notice that Esther responds directly to the king this time. If I have won the king's favor, in chapter 7, verses 3, if I have found favor with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. Esther wisely and creatively uses intimate language here that immediately connected with our king on a very intimate level. She proceeds to tell the king that he is still the king. She glorifies him. He is still her husband and puts him where he belongs. His emotions and his psychology is where it needs to be. Watch this. Then she pleads for mercy and for redemption from the king and for herself and our people, the Jews who had been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. Frederick Bush writes that during this time, Esther understands fully well the delicate nature of this request and the precarious nature of our position as queen. She understands that the threat against herself and our people are two perpetrators, both Haman and the king, and both are actively present with her at this banquet. So Esther understands that she must somehow fully expose Haman while at the same time never appearing in any way to be bringing any charge against the king. Hence, our response is extremely well thought out and presented with the utmost tact and respect. Esther understands that the king's passivity has made him just as responsible for the decree that Haman had written. He signed it, but Esther framed the situation to appear as though he had been victimized as well. Notice how she wisely uses the verb here in the passive voice. I and my people have been sold. Also, notice for the first time, she publicly identifies with the Jewish people, not specifically with their name, but with their fate through the words destroyed, killed, and annihilated. She avoided naming Haman until the king himself wanted to know it. Very wise lady here. Using these words, sold for destruction, killed or slaughtered, and annihilation. I think this is what the king is thinking and hearing. Did you just say sold? Sold by who? Who got paid? Why was I not paid? Who deceived me? Who got bribed? Something is missing here. All these questions are racing in the king's mind, and the king's response is breathtaking. I think the next phrase cannot be conveyed in words that we can fully understand the depth of the king's anger. Xerxes said, who is he? Where is the man who dare do such a thing. Men, think of the emotions, the anger, and the rage conveyed when Xerxes commands Esther to reveal who this man may be. He said, "Who is he?" His voice is raised to convey his position of power and of authority. His anger is evident. The lion in Xerxes has been wakened up. Run before you get eaten. Well, similarly, I want you to look also at Esther's response. Her response elicits the same emotions as the king. She reciprocates the voice of the king or the anger of the king in her response. This is what she said. The adversary and the enemy is this vile Haman in Esther chapter 7, verses 6. Notice also in a very creative way of engaging the king, Esther brilliantly left out Haman's identity in verse 3. Esther just gave the narrative. This is what is happening here. My king, I and my people are being sold. But in verse 6, Esther takes the risk and the literary, she grants the king the weapon by which he is to execute Haman. She said, the adversary and the enemy is this vile Haman. Had the king known from the beginning that Haman was the man, probably the king may have devised a plan to save his second in command. He's the one who crushed the plan to assassinate him in the past. He was granted power to continue crushing all opposition. The king might have saved Haman on those grounds. Who knows? He was his right hand man. The king might have protected Haman, and also Haman might have offered a good defense to Esther, accuser. But Esther is so wise and so brilliant. She does not give the king or nor Haman a chance to redeem themselves. Could it be this exceptional brilliantness came out of the 3 nights that she spent in prayer and fasting? Esther displays great wisdom, respect, and tact in addressing this problem. Esther put herself on the line and her life on the line, believing that the king would see the sense and favor her as his wife. The immediate reaction of the truth exposed by Esther here causes chaos at the palace. Everybody is in shock. The king runs out of the house to the garden, and Haman falls on his knees in terror, begging Esther, a Jewish woman, for his life. Esther is wondering what's going to be the king's response. The employees at the palace are all rushing left and right to find a place to hide. They all know this time it's going down. They know, and they have seen King Xerxes' anger and in action and his tempers. Everybody finds the nearest corner to hide from the king's rage. This rage here, I don't think can be contained or described using the English words. I think the words here are inadequate in describing Xerxes' reaction. He is breathing out fire, and he's actually trembling as he's speaking here. He cannot imagine someone who would have the audacity to sell his queen. He cannot imagine that there is someone within his 27 provinces with such courage to conduct business without his approval. And furthermore, his treasury is almost empty due to his war with Alexander the Great. And someone somewhere obviously did not pay his taxes. I'll not even attempt to explain what Haman is thinking and feeling at this time, but I know this. His forehead is frozen. He is in shock that this Jewish girl outplayed him before his boss. Haman's blood has drained out of his head, and he can only fall down on his knees and beg Esther for mercy. He cannot think or say anything to rescue himself at this time. Queen Esther's words have crippled him. He can only beg for mercy from Esther, the Jew whom he wanted to eliminate. What will Esther do? Will she be merciful to Haman? Will she say, okay, don't do it again? Or will she see him as an imminent and a present danger to herself and to the Jewish people? Will Esther drop her guard and compromise? Will Esther take the stand and remain committed to her calling? Mordecai had warned her that this was her moment, and she had resolved in her mind, if I perish, I perish. What will become of Esther's resolve at this time? Let us remember the history of Haman's people and God's hurt towards them. This act here is, I think, as a result of an assignment that rebellious King Saul, back in the book of Samuel, he failed to accomplish. And here we find Queen Esther doing what King Samuel or King Saul should have done years ago. Here, Haman sealed his own fate with his own foolishness. And therefore, the text reads, beginning from verses 6, Esther said, quote, an adversary, an enemy, this vile Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house? As soon as the words left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Habona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, a pole reaching a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. 75 feet. Paul is out there. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. Here we see, in a tragic moment, Haman's life coming to an end. Justice is served. A brave woman saves the day. God's favor and mercy and power and sovereignty is fully displayed in this particular passage. God bless you.